Alrighty. Okay. So again, welcome back, everyone. Thank you for coming. So our collector this week actually came to my attention when I was going through some records that had been georeferenced. So they had gotten coordinates added, and her name just stood out to me. So I was curious. This is Elizabeth G. Britton. You can see she was collecting in Bermuda in 1913. And I don't know if her name is familiar to any of you. It wasn't to me, but it turns out that she was a pretty important figure with some very strong connections to one of our global partners, which I will share with you today. But first, I'll show you the specimen. So this is our little moss over here. It's Trichostomum bermudanum, which today is a synonym of Weissia jamaicensis. It is found in the southern United States, Mexico, Central and South America, and the Caribbean West Indies, obviously kind of from those species names. And I found some images of it actually on iNaturalist, which you can see here. And if you may be familiar with iNaturalist, it's a website app that you can use to post pictures of plants, animals, fungi, things you see out and outside. And then you can basically kind of crowdsource an ID. So people will tell you what they think it is, etc., which is pretty cool. I will say that some of the scientists I work with have expressed a little bit of skepticism about some of the IDs on iNaturalist just because they're from photos. And for mosses, especially, sometimes, species, you have to look at them under a microscope to technically ID to species level. And with lichens, sometimes you even have to do chemical tests. So again, with a grain of salt, this is presumably things that are, at least look similar to our moss when it's alive. And our specimen was collected by Elizabeth Gertrude Britton. She was an American botanist, bryologist, and educator, born Elizabeth Gertrude Knight in 1858 in New York City. But she grew up largely in Cuba, where her family operated a furniture factory and a sugar plantation. And growing up on that island, she developed a very strong love for nature and also a knowledge of the Spanish language, which would come in handy later. She went to school in both Cuba and New York, eventually enrolling in a normal college in New York City. And this school, which was later renamed Hunter College, was founded in 1870 as a college for training teachers. And it was open to all qualified women, regardless of race, religion, or ethnic background, which was really uncommon at that time. Elizabeth graduated in 1875 at the young age of 17. And for the next 10 years, she worked as a teacher at that school. So she was a critic teacher, which I had to look up, but apparently it's a teacher who oversees student teachers practice teaching, if that makes sense. And then also as a natural science tutor. In 1879, she joined the Torrey Botanical Club, which had been founded in 1867. It claims to be the oldest botanical society in America, or in the Americas. Her first notable botanical achievements include finding and describing the fruit of this moss, Eustychium norvegicum, which had not been observed before, and also to finding this rare curly grass fern in Nova Scotia. She published her first scientific paper in 1881 in the Bulletin of the Torrey Botanical Society, and served as their curator of mosses from 1884 to 85. So she was clearly, obviously, specializing in biology. In 1885, she married Nathaniel L. Britton, who taught geology and botany at Columbia College, what would become Columbia University, and the pair became lifelong collaborators. They met as members of the Torrey Botanical Club, and after her marriage, she resigned her position as a teacher and took charge of the moss collections at Columbia College as an unofficial moss curator. While there, she helped acquire the collection of August Jaeger, who was an important Swiss bryologist, and she edited the Bulletin of the Torrey Botanical Club for 2 years, starting in 1886. In 1888, the pair sailed to London to visit the Royal Botanic Garden at Kew. So Nathaniel was working on Bolivian specimens from this American botanist explorer, Henry Hurd Rusby, and Elizabeth, while she was there, worked on mosses with the Linnaean Society of London. And one big takeaway from their visit at the gardens at Kew was it gave them the idea to create a similar institution in New York City, which would become the New York Botanical Gardens. So that's one of our global partners. It's one of the largest herbaria in the world. They have, I think, 7 million plus specimens. It was established by the state legislature in 1891, and the Brittons were intimately involved in leading fundraising efforts throughout the 1890s. By 1896, a site had been chosen and surveyed, and construction began on some of the buildings. So Nathaniel became the first director of the Botanical Gardens, and Elizabeth volunteered as, again, an unofficial moss curator, and they moved Columbia College's collections to the Botanical Gardens. So while her work was unpaid, she did become a well-known bryologist. She made extensive collections in the field across the US and Canada, especially in the Adirondack and Appalachian Mountains. Starting in 1901, she accompanied her husband on 23 of his 25 expeditions to the Caribbean and West Indies, visiting the Bahamas, Bermuda, Cuba, Jamaica, Trinidad and Tobago, and the US Virgin Islands. And Elizabeth's knowledge of the region and her Spanish language skills were obviously very helpful in many of these trips. I found some photo albums with pictures that her husband took on some of their expeditions. Regretfully, there's not a lot of pictures with them in them, but you can see some of the cities and landscapes that they visited. And I'll share a couple of my favorite pictures. One was this picture of a collecting mule, who you can see in 1903 carrying presumably boxes full of herbarium specimens, and this goat cart featuring Mrs. Britton. So there's Elizabeth there, and I'm not sure exactly what's going on, but it looks kind of fun. So the pair made 16 trips to Puerto Rico, collecting 10,000 specimens and describing a number of new species. And they also helped to establish forestry policy on the islands. Back in the States, Elizabeth helped the New York Botanical Garden acquire the collection of William Mitten, who was an English chemist and bryologist who built a collection of 50,000 mosses, lichens, and liverworts. And she spent several years organizing that collection. She also oversaw the work of doctoral students at Columbia College, training the next generation of bryologists, even though she didn't have an advanced degree herself, which is obviously super impressive. And in 1912, she was finally made the honorary curator of mosses at the New York Botanical Gardens, still unpaid, and she would hold that position for the rest of her life. So she researched and wrote extensively on moss distribution and taxonomy, publishing 170 of her 346 scientific papers on mosses in a wide range of periodicals and books. She wrote the moss sections for a number of floras, along with describing a number of new taxa. Tropicos has her name associated with 194 different plant names, including bryophytes and ferns. In 1897, she chaired the division of Bryophyta for the Women's National Science Club. She co-founded the Sullivant Moss Society with bryologist Abel Joel Grout, who was actually one of her doctoral students. And this organization was the precursor for the American Bryological and Lichenological Society. And she served as its president from 1916 to 1919. In addition to mosses, she was also a really passionate advocate for the preservation of wildflowers. And she helped organize the Wildflower Preservation Society of America in 1902, serving on their board of managers and as secretary and treasurer. She was very active publishing, lecturing, and writing letters to influence state legislation. She organized activities with schools and garden clubs. She published a series of 14 articles called Wild Plants Needing Protection, in which she gave detailed descriptions, illustrations for each species, and explained why they were important. She chaired the Conservation Committee of the Federated Garden Clubs of New York in 1925 and led a successful boycott against the harvesting of American holly from the wild for Christmas decorations, instead promoting growing it commercially using cuttings. And she passed away in 1934 after a stroke at the age of 76. So her place in the scientific community was recognized during her career. So in 1893, she was the only woman nominated as a charter member of the Botanical Society of America. In 1905, she was one of 3 bryologists appointed to a nomenclatural committee that would report to the International Botanical Congress. And that's a meeting every 6 years of all the botanists around the world, all different subject matters, to get together and talk about policy. And in 1906, she was one of only 19 women included in the first edition of American Men in Science, which I think we've mentioned before is a reference book of notable scientists. And more than that, her name is actually marked with an asterisk or a star, which means she was considered one of the top 1,000 scientists in that book. And for botany, she was considered in the top 100. There's only 100, the top 100 in botany. And her name was starred in 5 different editions all the way up to 1933, so the year before she passed away. So it's still very relevant, obviously. So in spite of this recognition, botany was still very much a boys' club. So one article said, though she seems to have been accepted as a scientist by her predominantly male colleagues, she and other female scientists were still apparently excluded from the social aspects of their work. Britton never felt comfortable enough to attend any of the Botanical Society of America's professional banquets, warning her friend and fellow bryologist Annie Morrill Smith of the group's unwritten prohibition of female attendance at their dinners. So she did form many strong working partnerships with other women botanists, including Annie Morrill Smith, who was mentioned before, who was also a bryologist, and she referred to Britton in her letters as Sister Bryophyte. And also found a number of specimens, and a reference here to her working with Miss Delia W. Marble, with whom she spent 4 weeks collecting on the island of St. Thomas, while Dr. Britton and Dr. Schaefer cruised around among the islands of the archipelago in search of cacti and other plants. And these are 2 on my list to hopefully look a little bit more into for some subsequent weeks. The moss genus Bryobritonia is named in her honor, as well as 15 species of plants, including Britton's maidenhair fern and Mrs. Britton's shadow witch orchid, which is this plant here. And she collected the type specimens for both of those plants. There is a Mount Britton in El Yunque National Forest in Puerto Rico, which actually honors both Brittons and the work that they did in that country. I read one article that said, upon Elizabeth's death in 1934, the governor of Puerto Rico personally wired condolences to her husband, and both branches of the Puerto Rican legislature passed resolutions of appreciation and sympathy. Unsurprisingly, the moss herbarium at the New York Botanical Garden was named after her. And interestingly, in the novel, The Signature of All Things, the main character, who is a female botanical explorer, was based in part on Elizabeth, according to the author. So pretty interesting connection, and I really need to read that book. So specimen-wise, I found almost 13,000 bryophyte specimens, almost 2,000 lichens, over 12,000 vascular plants, and 2,000 fungi. I will say that some of those are specimens collected by her husband. It's kind of hard to pull those apart in big queries, but a lot of them are collected by Elizabeth or together with Elizabeth, especially a lot of the mosses, most of the mosses are her specimens, so pretty big numbers. The Mertz Library at the New York Botanical Gardens houses her archive, so it has personal papers, manuscripts, published research, artwork, and photographs. And they also have her field notebooks, which are kind of neat to see, list of specimens that she was collecting throughout her travels. So so that is Elizabeth G. Britton. At least one source called her the mother of American bryology. And I will end once again with a quote. At a time when professional opportunities for women were rigidly delimited, Elizabeth Britton seems all the more outstanding through her leadership, influence, strong personality, and indomitable will. Her enthusiasm and dedication to botany have left a lasting mark on the garden and its moss collections. So so a very impressive woman in science whose work, we're making more accessible with this project. So thanks again for your help, and thank you for listening.